Oh, yeah, doing the wiggle. Wiggle, 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 wiggle. Okay.
Feel free to heckle that one. So, for you guys' info, so I'm just starting with the readings. So, all right. We have two readings today, one from the book of the prophet Jeremiah, and the second from the American prophet James Baldwin. From Jeremiah. Jeremiah received the Lord's word when Babylon's king Nebuchadnezzar and his army, and all the countries and people he ruled, were attacking Jerusalem and all its towns. The Lord, the God of Israel, proclaims, "Go and speak to Judah's king Zedekiah, and say to him, the Lord proclaims, I am handing the city over to the king of Babylon, and he will burn it down. You won't escape, but will be captured and handed over to him." Jeremiah received the Lord's word after King Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people in Jerusalem to proclaim liberty for their slaves. Everyone was to free their male and female Hebrew slaves and no longer hold a Judean brother or sister in bondage. So all the officials and people who entered into this covenant agreed to free their male and female slaves and no longer hold them in bondage. They obeyed the king's command and let them go. But afterward, they broke their promise, took back the men and women they had freed, and enslaved them again. Then the Lord's word came to Jeremiah. The Lord, the God of Israel, proclaims, I made a covenant with your ancestors when I brought them out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. I said that every 7th year, each of you must free any Hebrews who have been sold to you. And after they have served you for 6 years, you must set them free. But your ancestors didn't obey or pay attention to me. Recently you turned about and did what was right in my sight. Each of you proclaimed liberty for the other and made a covenant before me in the temple that bears my name. But then you went back on your word and made my name impure. Each of you reclaimed the men and women you had set free and forced them to be your slaves again. Therefore the Lord proclaims, since you have defied me by not setting your fellow citizens free, I'm setting you free, declares the Lord, free to die by the sword, disease, and famine. And I will make you an object of horror for all nations on earth. I'm about to issue orders, declares the Lord, that the army of Babylon return to this city. They will wage war against it, capture it, and burn it down along with other Judean cities. I will make Judah a wasteland without inhabitants. The reading from James Baldwin. This innocent country set you down in a ghetto, in which, in fact, it intended that you should perish. You were born into a society which spelled out with brutal clarity and in as many ways as possible that you were a worthless human being. You were not expected to aspire to excellence. You were expected to make peace with mediocrity. I'm fascinated by our reading from the Hebrew Bible. Isn't it amazing? I mean, first, you never hear it. For me, this is the first time I've even read it. And then, it's so full of richness and depth and movement and transformation and emotion, and that's despite there being that much plot action, right? So the story starts with a tragedy. You've got Jerusalem, the socio-political, religious center of life of the whole nation. But you've got a problem. There's these pesky Babylonians who decide the next hip thing to do is build this gigantic empire where they go for, guess what? World domination. A little cliche, don't you think? And so, they look at this tiny nation over there named Judah, and they say, dang Judah, look at that southern kingdom. You know what would go well on this beautiful, oh so strategically placed strip of land? My armies. And, while we're at it, my empire. And so, Babylon swoops into Judah and annihilates most of her towns, and then prepares itself for the motherlode, the capital, the symbolic seat of power for the entire, rather small, kingdom. They besiege the city, trapping everyone inside its walls, waiting to either starve them out or mess with their heads so much through psychological warfare that they just give up. And that is where our passage begins. God speaks to the prophet Jeremiah right in the middle of this attack. And God says, go to the king, the guy named Zedekiah, and tell him, you guys are screwed. Now, of course, we're wondering why God would abandon God's special city. I mean, hey, this is God's city, isn't it? God has a throne in the temple. What's up with that? So the text is kind enough to offer a flashback so we can unravel what's going on here. So we learn that these people got a little bit scared when big bad Babylon came and camped out outside their walls and lobbed human heads over and told them how it would be utterly annihilated. Funny thing, that gets to some people. And so they decided to free all their Hebrew slaves. Well, this is all fine and dandy, and so God apparently makes the Babylonians go away. They lift the siege and stop terrorizing Jerusalem. Perfect. Worked just like it was supposed to. So, everyone takes their slaves back and life goes back to normal. End of flashback. So God said, y'all are screwed. I told you way back when that you can only own slaves for 6 years before sending them free on the 7th. But you didn't do it. And now, when you were under siege, you tried to make it all better. But then, you went back on them. You forced them back into slavery. And then, we have this wonderfully ironic proclamation from God. Since you have defied me by not setting your fellow citizens free, I'm setting you free. Free to die by the sword, disease, and famine. Then he goes on and says, Babylon is going to come back and burn you to the ground. They're going to make you into a wasteland. Isn't this a fascinating story? It's just wonderful. So when I hear this story, I dwell on one big question. Why did the Israelites free those slaves? The biblical account doesn't really supply that answer, encouraging us to dive in and try and figure it out ourselves. So, I've got a theory. See, God reminds us of part of the law Moses got earlier in history. Your slaves have a shelf life of 6 years before you have to release them. That's part of the package of the covenant. That's part of the rules for being God's people. You act this way towards slaves. Now, these are debt slaves. So they're Israelites going into slavery because they're trapped in devastating poverty, unable to pay off their debts. And they pay it off by becoming a slave for 6 years. So God is saying in this covenant, this debilitating debt isn't who you are forever. It does not define who you are in your being. You are an Israelite, a child of God, not a slave. And see, the Israelites in the story who owned slaves, chances are they had forgotten, or didn't really forget, These are probably well-to-do people, they're educated, they grew up learning about the covenant and knew what God required of them, so, they didn't really forget, but they just, didn't let them go. They're free human labor, why would you give that up? And so the slaveholders just conveniently forgot. But now, Babylon comes along, and man, are the Israelites scared. And so, in crises like these, it leads to a little soul searching. Why would God let this happen? Someone brings up the elephant in the room. Wasn't that little rule in the Torah that we just conveniently forgot about? Not owning human beings indefinitely? And so, they come to the conclusion they were being attacked because of their failure to follow the covenant they made with God. Because they didn't do what they were supposed to. They had to acknowledge the whole time that it was wrong, but they refused to do anything about it because their convenience, greed, desire for free labor was more powerful than their desire for justice. They knew that they were violating the covenant and acting unjustly. So, they released the slaves. I don't believe, though, that they were walking through every day thinking all the time about how they were violating the covenant. Yet it was there, latent, invisible, Though the question must be raised, invisible to whom? Because what was so invisible to them, from the collective consciousness, shoving it to the dark recesses of the soul so they don't have to think about it or deal with it, what was invisible to them was surely not invisible to these slaves, to those people trapped in this death-dealing arrangement without the social leverage to better their situation. To the slave owners, to turn their thoughts on this topic, to bring it up, it was a new problem that just arose, situational, that they had to deal with. But for the slaves, it was anything but a new problem. For them, it was a public unmasking of what they had been privy to all along. And moreover, what was nothing new for the slaves were the slave owners going back on their word as soon as the Babylonians packed up to leave. And let's be clear, there was no conversion bolt of morality that swooped down and convinced them that owning slaves was wrong. After all, they didn't free all the slaves. They freed all the Israelites in debt servitude. The text tells us nothing about those non-Israelite slaves that didn't get freed every 7 years in the covenant. They stayed just as enslaved as ever. This wasn't a brilliant understanding that slavery is itself morally despicable. No, they simply figured out that they were on the wrong side of the covenant. This was a shrewd, calculating move with surgical precision because they identified their one problem and fixed it. And isn't that how we are today too? And by we, I mean us white folks, us who have historically had and continue to have racial societal power. But ain't that just like us? Like the enslaving Israelites, we white Americans only pay attention to the continuations of slavery, to the moral problems inherent within it that we continue to act out. We only pay attention when it flares up. I mean, our utter lack of attention unless it jumps up and bites us in the face. And then we only pay attention until that immediate crisis is averted. We act exactly like the Israelites here. We make a shrewd calculation. Exactly what minor concession do we give to diffuse the boiling over of racial pain? And then we just repeal it. I mean, look at the legislation passed in the Civil Rights era. As much as we pride ourselves now on how great that period of our history is, the only reason that black folks got legislation that moved them a few steps closer to equality in the eyes of the state was because they dragged it out of us kicking and screaming. King said it best. History is the long and tragic story of the fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. And then now, the Supreme Court has gutted the Civil Rights Act because apparently the South doesn't have any more racism. Like the enslaving Israelites, we white Americans pay attention to the continuations of slavery only when it flares up. Poet and prophet James Baldwin puts it poetically when he says, "One day, to everyone's astonishment, someone drops a match in a powder keg and everything blows up." That's what we saw in Ferguson. When you shove a people to the ground and kick them over and over and over, you're packing that gunpowder into that keg until one day that match drops. And it's never quite the same again. Only when Ferguson exploded did we get to a place that we had to look in the mirror and assess ourselves. Only then did we see, just as Israel breached their covenant with God, clinging desperately onto their slaves, we too have breached our ethical covenant to love our neighbors as ourselves. We too cling on to the systems of slavery that we still can't let go. But hear the good news. God is on the side of justice. In the passage, the consequences for injustice, for slavery, are death and displacement. God is nothing if not serious here. And hear the good news. God is at work with or without church. Praise be to God that God is not tied to us as the church, acting and getting our act together. God is already at work in the world through queer, tattooed, pants-sagging, cussing young black folks in Ferguson who don't give a shit about your respectability politics. God is at work through community organizers who get arrested for the sake of saving black lives. God is at work through those strict voices who insist we sever the bonds that keep our brothers, sisters, and family enslaved. God is at work when we acknowledge that we must change the systems that we benefit from, that we know are wrong, but we can't cut the ties of. God is at work in the world, putting an end to death, to destroying those structures that keep people enslaved, even after society claims that they've been liberated. And God will do this empire-building work with whomsoever wishes to join in. And thanks be to God, God is free to act, even when we, being more white than Christian, fail to join in. God is at work in the world, bringing the empire of God to fruition, regardless of whether or not the ecclesia joins. Thanks be to God.